Hello, everybody. Wait a couple minutes till people show up. I'm going to try this gaming URL thing that everyone's talking about. I think I've seen this before. Oh, yeah, this is pretty slick. Nice. I kind of find it hard to read the white on the black when I'm not looking at that screen, though. Cool. So something I was working on earlier. So I did I had a meetup with my local PHP user group on Wednesday night, and something I wanted to figure out because I didn't have like a good solution for it at the time was a good way to make it easy for me to log requests that my app is making when I dispatch webhooks. So right now you can see, like, when I try to fulfill a purchase with KiteTail, we log the response that came back to help you troubleshoot, but I didn't have a good way of logging the request that we sent, like not the request down to the exact detail, like every header that was added, including like the guzzle user agent and stuff like that. So at my user group meetup, we did like some mob programming, and we worked on a feature for ZTTP that allows you to register a before sending callback that looks like this. So I can say ZTTP before sending, run this callback, and then I program the request however I want. And then as soon as you call post or get or one of these methods that actually goes and fires the request, after the request is fully constructed, it'll run your callback and give you a copy of the request that it's about to send so you can do stuff with it. So in my case, I'm kind of doing this. I'm not super happy with how this looks, but I haven't been able to come up with a way that works and is simpler and cleaner. But basically, I'm capturing this request outside of this callback back up into this scope so that when I create an instance of this Webhook Delivery object, I'm calling it, I have access to the request that was used to deliver the webhook and the response that came back from delivering the webhook. So I was working on making some changes to this class to support that, and updating the tests and stuff like that. And I think what I'd like to do ultimately is make it possible to show that stuff inside this fulfillment attempts table. So we can click between like the request data and the response data, something like that. So I think the first step is to, first of all, these changes that I've made to the Webhook Dispatcher are not reflected in my fake Webhook Dispatcher yet. So I drove all these changes out with tests, but the fake version still behaves differently. So I want to take a look at the fake Webhook Dispatcher and think about what I need to do to it to get it to behave the same as the real Webhook Dispatcher. So to start, let's look at our feature test for purchasing products. So there's this kind of monstrous test here, which I mentioned on the last stream that I was thinking maybe we could use this stream to refactor some of this stuff. But I think before we do that, I want to update this test to work with kind of the new contract of the Webhook Dispatcher. And then when all that's done, I can look at splitting this up into different chunks. So let's think. So what we're doing here is verifying that after we attempt to purchase a product, that a fulfillment attempt was made. And when we grab that fulfillment attempt, we have some details about that fulfillment attempt, right? Like the URL we tried to hit, what the response status was, the response headers, and the response content. And all that stuff is getting set up here. So basically what I'm doing is when I construct a fake Webhook Dispatcher, I sort of program it with an endpoint or an array of endpoints, and then what the fake Webhook Dispatcher should return from those endpoints. So since we want to also store the request information, I have to think about how I'm going to specify that in the tests. And that is a little bit trickier, I think. So I'm trying to think if that's something that I want to specify with data like this, or if that's something that I actually want to like bake some logic into the fake Webhook Dispatcher to work that way. Let's think about it. I mean, why don't we start with the assertions and figure out what we would want to be doing differently. So if we look at the database schema, here's the response headers is just a bunch of JSON. The response body is a string that we can decode to JSON if the request was successful. We have the response status and we have the URL that's being requested. But I think we also need to have, just like the response headers and the response body, I think we need the request headers and the request body. So I'm going to copy this assertion about the response headers and call it request headers, but let's just think about what we want to pass through. So if we have, are we passing through, does this product have a secret? I'm not sure if it does, but it doesn't really matter in this case. Again, it's really like up to the Webhook Dispatcher. So I wonder if we should hard code that into the stub data. Let's we'll have an empty array here for now. I mean, like, it's going to be a JSON content type. It's going to have a body, which is going to be the payload that gets sent through. So if you look at the purchase class, it has this toWebhook method. This is actually kind of interesting to me when I think about it, because I'm not sure if there was anything in our tests currently that would break if I commented this out, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about, kind of a smell. Let's comment this stuff out for a second and run this one test. So this test is green. If we were to mess up this whole method, okay, so we do get an error. Oh, I think it's because we have some tests for the Webhook Dispatcher to assert that it delivered this data. So that's actually okay. Okay, so that's valuable. But we are going to want to basically take this now and if we're going to have a request body here, let's start with the request body and then think about the request headers later. How does that sound as an idea? It's kind of repetitive, but again, I think a lot of the things here that I don't like are going to get fixed when we do the refactoring eventually, and kind of introduce some more boundaries so we don't have to test so much in the same test. Okay, so undefined variable purchase. So the purchase is up here, so we're going to have to use the purchase, which sucks, and probably the credit card gateway too, which to me is a smell, well, not a smell, but a sign that it would just be simpler if we just used a temporary variable here, which is kind of crappy, but whatever. We'll make do. Again, one day we'll figure out a way to simplify this test a lot. Let's just kind of get it passing. Okay, null does not match expected type array. So request body is coming back as null. So let's go to the purchase and think about how to fix that. So right now we're saying that the Webhook Dispatcher should return like a response. The new changes to the Webhook Dispatcher return a Webhook Delivery instead, which is not how things were working before. So let's comment this out. And while we have this test passing, refactor some things with the fake and the purchase. So this response is actually going to be a delivery. And we're going to have to extract the response from the delivery to go ahead and do this part. And we're not going to throw the exception anymore, but let's just get this part working first. So if we run this, now we get an error, call the member function response on array. So that's kind of like a sign that the fake is returning a different value than the real one. So what we actually want to do here is return a new Webhook delivery. It's going to take a request, a request which we don't have yet. So let's just do this for a second. So we kind of have like that as a sign. And then this response is going to be kind of funky because I think if we look at the Webhook delivery, it's expecting like a ZTTP response and ZTTP request. And we extract some stuff from it this way. So this is interesting to me because I think like what we should do here instead is update the Webhook Dispatcher to not pass in these the ZTTP request and ZTTP response. Instead, I think what we should do in hindsight, now that I see what we would have to do in the fake, is move this logic for mapping these out into the Webhook Dispatcher. So let's work with the Webhook Dispatcher tests for a minute while we do this. So the tests are green. Now here, let's do something like this build request from the guzzle or from the ZTTP request. And this will be this build response. And now this is going to fail because those methods don't exist. Right? Whatever. So we'll stick them at the bottom. Build request, which takes a ZTTP request, and build response, which takes a ZTTP response. And we can get things passing again just by returning these values immediately. So let's see what we got now. Okay, so we're back to green. So now I think what we want to do is take the code that's inside the Webhook delivery. So this request method that dynamically maps this every time. I'm going to copy that out, stick it in here, and replace instances of this request with ZTTP request. Delete this return value. Head over to the delivery and change this to just return this request, since it's going to be pre-mapped now. And hopefully this passes still. Okay. So refactoring 1 was successful. So now we want to do the same thing with build response. So let's copy this, replace this implementation, replace references to this response with this ZTTP response, and it's not this, it's the parameter. And then replace this with just referencing the response. Oh, is success on array. Okay, so was successful, which we used to delegate to the ZTTP response. Okay, so we have tests for 300 responses are failures, 400 are failures, and 500 are failures. So this was something I was worried we were going to have to do eventually, and now I'm kind of bummed that we might have to do it in more places than I thought. But basically, I have to re-implement some logic from ZTTP because we're sort of treating ZTTP as a third-party library, and the Webhook Delivery now has no knowledge of ZTTP, right? Like it's sort of intended to be decoupled from it. It's just the dispatcher that happens to be using ZTTP to make its request and then translating those responses into like a domain-specific structure that we're using for the Webhook deliveries. So we're going to have to basically copy some logic out of here, which I think is fine because yeah, I think it's okay. So instead of this status, this is going to be this response. And these are just plain associative arrays right now, but they might become objects eventually. And this is going to be response at the status key. So let's run the test again. Okay, so we're green. Okay, so now that we've kind of changed the contract of our Webhook delivery stuff and the way that we construct the request response stuff, now in the fake, instead of having to construct a ZTTP request or a ZTTP response, which would be bad because then our fake would have knowledge of the underlying library that the real implementation uses, now our fake only has to worry about constructing these structures, which is a lot easier and more agnostic. So here where we were saying request equals null and then getting this stub, let's take a look at what the stub looks like. So it's status, headers, and body. And I honestly think this is the same. Status, headers, and body. Okay, so now this structure here is actually already identical to a response format. So we can actually leave this as it is. It's just this one that's more interesting. So like, I'm just gonna do, something to let us know that we're gonna have to put something here. Something that has a URL, which is gonna be the endpoint, but we'll wait till our tests force us to do that. And the URL, the headers, and the body of the request. Okay, so let's go back to the test. So this is the endpoint that we're expecting to hit, right? So we already have a test that says we're getting that here. Although one thing I think is going to be smart to do is right now we're storing the, this is interesting. So if we look at the fulfillment attempt, you notice how to get the request URL, the URL that the webhook was sent to, we were forced to pass in the purchase, so the purchase could extract that webhook URL. Now that we have access to the full delivery, which includes the request, instead of passing in the delivery response and the purchase, I think we're going to be able to pass in just the whole delivery, not pass in the purchase at all, and use the URL from the delivery's request, which to me is more of an accurate representation anyways, because that's the URL we actually hit, rather than whatever the URL is that is associated with the product. Now, they're going to be the exact same URL, like guaranteed, but it makes more sense to me to get it from the actual webhook than it does to duplicate getting it from the product twice, because this is what seeds the URL in here. So it's always going to be the same, but this makes it kind of feel like one path instead of getting it from the same place on two separate occasions. Okay, so that's cool. I think this is going to clean things up. So I think maybe what we could do is actually do that change first before we make any other changes. So let's update the purchase to, instead of creating it from a webhook response, let's call it from a webhook delivery, and we'll change it down here as well. And now I'm actually also going to get rid of this whole exception handling thing too, because we're not throwing exceptions from the Webhook Dispatcher anymore. So there's some like serious changes that we're making. But anyways, this is going to take the whole delivery now, not just the delivery response. And I think we can get this working quickly by just updating this to Webhook Delivery, not accepting the purchase, accepting the delivery, extracting the status from delivery response status headers body, and getting the URL from delivery request URL. And let's just double check the Webhook Dispatcher to make sure that that's right. It's going to be this. So this is obviously going to not work right now. So here, when we pass through the fake one, this will have to have a URL, which is just going to be the endpoint that came in. And let's run it. I don't know. Okay. Class Webhook Delivery not found in the fake dispatcher. That's okay. So let's import that and run it again. We're green. That's scary and exciting at the same time. Okay, so we successfully changed how that works. So I think this whole thing is going to get simpler as we go here. This all is going to have to go, but okay, let's think about what's next. So the next thing that we want to assert, I think, is about the request body. And I think we can assume, I'm trying to decide, like, so the response body, we don't assume to be JSON. We have a method for decoding it. So I think I think it makes sense to be symmetrical there. So let's say that this should be the request JSON, and we'll make that like a method similar to response JSON that's going to delegate to request body and JSON decode it. And let's just run this and see what happens. Okay, call the undefined method request JSON on the query builder, which is really the fulfillment attempt. So here we have like response JSON, right? So let's add request JSON. Yep. And this is going to basically work the same way. I added this JSON class because you know how JSON encode or JSON decode doesn't throw an error if it blows up? You have to do like check JSON last error and all this stuff. So I made this class to make it easy for me to just like call encode or decode whenever I want. And the nice thing about decode is I default it to always using an associative array, so I never have to go JSON underscore decode true blah blah blah. I can just say JSON : decode, which is kind of nicer. So let's JSON decode the request body and run this test again, and this is going to fail. JSON decode syntax error. Okay, so I think the problem is like you can't JSON decode null, right? Because that's what the request body is here. So let's try and save the request body when we save the fulfillment attempt. So if we look at purchase fulfill, where we do this stuff, I'm going to break my own style guide for a second here because admittedly it's easier to read in this case where it's not returning anything. If we just put all this stuff on separate lines so we can kind of see the separate steps because we're doing some gnarly work. And run this again. Yeah, I copied the implementations from Guzzle because I didn't want to have I didn't want to reference the Guzzle versions everywhere. But I could defer to the Guzzle ones, which is interesting. Okay, so we're back to that same error, which is good. So when we create the fulfillment attempt from the webhook delivery, we need to make sure that we are extracting the request body. So here in the fulfillment attempt, I think we're going to want to say request body is going to be delivery request body. And then we're going to have headers here too, but I'm just going to leave it commented out until like our tests kind of force us to actually have it, but just as like a placeholder. So like there's 3 for the request and then there's 3 for the response. So this is going to fail because I'm pretty sure this key is going to be undefined or unset. Yeah, undefined index body. So we need to make sure that our fake dispatcher provides a body somehow. And I guess in this case, the easiest way to do that is to just JSON encode the payload. So I'm going to use the regular function here because we're kind of in fake territory and not inside the app. And I kind of want this to be able to like stand on its own for the most part. So let's see what happens now. Okay, fulfillment attempts has no column request body, so that's a good sign. Let's create the fulfillment attempts table, or we already have it, but let's go into it, and we'll make the request body a string, and we're gonna have like JSON-B headers in here too. I'm just gonna leave this here as a note for myself, but again, leave it commented out until we're actually forced by the tests to make that exist. Okay, so let's see what happens now. Hey, it's passing. So that's good. All right, so we're storing the request URL. We're storing the request body. The next thing that we need to do is store the request headers. So this one is interesting because I can't decide where to specify the headers. Because it's kind of like the job of the Webhook Dispatcher to send the right headers. So I don't really know what headers it's going to send. All I really know is that I want headers to be there. So I'm tempted in this case to maybe do something like this. Like, I know that the content type should be application JSON, and there could be other headers too. So I'll hard code this into the fake, I think, and then just kind of make that kind of an assumption you have to understand. And this will give me enough confidence to know that if I screw something up where I'm not extracting the headers properly, then it should hopefully fail. So we might want to add a custom header that we can seed or something to really be sure. I think like the limit for a string column in MySQL is actually really high. MySQL string column max. Yeah, whatever. Let's see. I always find the documentation really hard to read. So it looks like the max length is almost 22,000 characters with UTF-8. Yeah. Basically the same as text. I don't understand the reason for using one or the other, honestly. Is the default 255? So if we look at the string method on the blueprint class, default string length. What's this builder class? Schema builder. Oh yeah, you're right. Interesting. Okay. I like what you're getting at here. So let's change this to text and change the response body to text too. I know like that stores these differently, which is why I usually avoid it. But again, I don't know anything about databases. Okay, so we're saying that we want the content type to be set to application JSON, and we're not doing that here. So let's create some headers in the fake, and we'll just have a content type one. And run this again. Now this is actually messed up in a lot of ways because this doesn't even take the secret or anything. So I think I have a lot of work ahead of me in terms of trying to synchronize the fake and the real one, and I need to add some contract tests for that. Okay, so we're still not saving it. So in the fulfillment attempt, we need to extract those now. And this is probably still going to fail because of some stuff related to JSON casting. Okay, so let's go to our table. So we want to store that as JSON-B, which I'm pretty sure in SQLite doesn't exist anyways. So we get array to string conversion, which is correct. So we'll have to add that as a cast. So let's add the request headers as an array too. Okay, green. All right. So that's feeling better. I think though we're going to want to make some similar changes in some of these other tests. Man, this file needs to get cleaned up. Okay, so let's just paste this in here for a second. So that's the request stuff. So we're going to want to have to get the response side of that too. And these are the same. That's the same. Some of this stuff will change though. So let's delete this. And I'm not sure what the body is actually going to be because we're not asserting against the whole thing in this case. It should be adam@example.com for sure. And then whatever we set the price of the product to be, so $49. The country I think is going to be Canada. Yeah. And the zip is going to be this. And I'm pretty sure the tax is going to be some amount. So $55.37, $49, and $6.37. This is super overspecified, but I think it's fine. I can't wait to clean this test up. Okay, green. Let's copy this. There's at least one more place to do this. So there's the BC sales tax test. Okay, so in this case, we need to take Yaz's postal code, and it's going to be yaz@example.com. 5145 and 245 in tax. Okay, green. And I bet, hopefully if we change that, we get a failure. Yeah, okay, so it is valid. Now I think the webhook failing one is going to be totally incorrect in a bunch of ways. Yeah, okay, so let's see how this one works. So in this case, we're mocking the Webhook Dispatcher and saying that it should throw an exception. But this is not how I want this to work anymore. Instead, I want it to return a webhook delivery. I just want it to be a failed delivery. So let's duplicate this and program this mock to return that instead. So I think it's easier to duplicate this whole section and write it slightly differently. Since we don't need to do anything fancy with throwing exceptions, we can actually simplify this. So mock array lets you pass a callback as the second argument that accepts the mock and lets you program the mock. But since we just need to do something simple, we can also just pass an array instead. And here we can just say it should receive deliver. And then we can specify the return value, which is going to be a new webhook delivery with a request and a response passed in. So here's going to be our request, and here's going to be our response. And this will probably be the response. But the request is going to be different. So the request is going to have this URL. It's going to have headers. There's going to be some duplication here that I'm going to have to think about how to improve. Content type. And then a body, which is going to be like a JSON encoded version of some gnarly purchase attempt. So we use the Dorinda example here, so I'm just going to copy that one. This. More or less. Okay. We can simplify it probably though. So we actually don't have a purchase yet. So since we're just going to use like a mock for this, I think we can just hard code in some values here. So we'll just say ID 1, product ID 1, and then charge ID, like some random charge ID. Really doesn't matter. All that matters is that the fulfillment attempt still gets saved with the data that the webhook delivery comes back with. So let's copy this crap again. And down here, we paste that in. This can go. Okay, so we're not going to make an assertion about the response JSON this time. What do I have as server error body? Oh, I have like a fairly realistic big ass example. Okay. So instead of making an assertion about the response JSON, I think we want to make an assertion about the response body. And just make sure that that's the same as this server error body. And the headers, I think, are the same. The status is going to be a 500. And the request stuff, this is going to be 1 and I think 2. And then whatever we had is that charge ID. And this is a hairy one. But once we get it passing, then we can think about what to do differently. So I think this is still going to fail. I didn't expect a syntax error, but that's fine. Okay, no webhook delivery found in the purchasing product test. Okay, so let's import that class. So we're getting a syntax error and fulfillment attempt 35 when we try to decode something. Where's response JSON getting called? Okay, that's getting called here because the webhook delivery doesn't fail anymore. So this is what we actually want to do. I'm going to duplicate all this so we don't lose it for a second. Just for reference. And we don't want to do a try catch anymore. We do want to throw fulfillment failed. If it fails, I'm not going to get it from the exception anymore. We're only going to save the response if it doesn't fail. or sorry, the URL. This is always going to happen. But now this code needs some conditional stuff. So this is going to be something like if fulfillment attempt let's start with if delivery was successful. So if the delivery was successful, then we want to store the fulfillment URL. Else, if it wasn't successful, we don't want to store the URL, and we want to fire off a fulfillment failed event. So let's see if that fixes this problem. Okay, this is actually not as bad of a problem as I was expecting to run into. Did we have 1 for both of those? Yeah, ID 1, product ID 1. I'm going to do 1 and 2 just so that they're different. Okay, content encoding. Okay, so this is probably just a matter of having my assertions wrong. I copied these as like real values from like a Laravel 500 just to try and make it as like somewhat realistic as possible. Okay, so it's green now. Is the whole file green? Is the whole suite green? Nope. Integrity constraint violation. This is probably just a model factory issue. View single order test. Yeah, so we create some fulfillment attempts. Okay, so let's look at our model factory. Fulfillment attempt. So let's seed this with some stuff. We'll just have empty request headers, or maybe we'll have a content type. And then the request body, which doesn't really matter. We could make it look like a realistic purchase, but I'm just going to do this for now and run this test again. Array to string conversion. Oh yeah, this needs to be JSON encoded. Green. Ah, I lost my terminal. Are we still green? We're still green. Actually, I quit it again. That was silly. Okay, and let's run the Webhook Dispatcher test. Green. Cool. So, did we delete the unnecessary code here? No. So let's delete all this crap now. So one thing I would like to do, which I haven't figured out the best solution for yet. There's a couple things I still need to do with this side of code. This stuff here, where I'm assuming that there's going to be a URL key set in the response, if the response comes back successful, is not really guaranteed to be true. Someone might return a 200 and not return a URL, and my code will blow up in that case. So I have that in my to-do list as something to basically work on validating the fulfillment attempt, you know, something like that, to make sure that they actually gave me back something. And I also am not totally sure that I like calling was successful on the delivery here. I kind of feel like once I convert the delivery into a fulfillment attempt, that I shouldn't really be touching the delivery anymore. So I feel like I should be asking the fulfillment attempt if it was successful. And the thing that's a bummer about that is if we look at the Webhook Delivery class, this is where I had to copy the code from CTTP, right? Actually, you know what? This doesn't bother me as much because I was going to say it would suck to have to duplicate this again. But if we remove it here, actually I still need to keep it there. I was going to say I could remove it here and move it to the to the fulfillment attempt and not have to have it duplicated. But I'm relying on the method call here to check like whether or not the delivery was successful. So there's two ways that I could do it, I guess. One option is to have another column in the fulfillment attempt that says, like, stores whether or not it was successful instead of having to like compute that based on the status. And then I could just store that by asking the Webhook delivery if it was successful. Another option is to duplicate the logic. I'm going to start by duplicating the logic, I think, because I could see more criteria going into determining if a fulfillment attempt was successful. Like, for a fulfillment attempt to be successful, the webhook needs to be successful and the response needs to be formatted correctly. You know, like maybe there's other concerns like that to think about. So why don't we just paste this in here for now? And this is actually going to be just response status. And then we can change that inside the purchase class to ask the fulfillment attempt if it was successful instead. And we're still green, which is good. So we don't really need the delivery variable anymore. Like, if we wanted to, although it admittedly like looks gross, we could like inline this whole thing, right? Which is kind of like what I was trying to get at. Like, it's not so much like I want it to be inlined, it's that the structure of the code supports inlining it. You know, like the fact that it can be inlined is like a good sign that I'm not storing a variable and then using it in a bunch of different places. So this should still run. Yeah, so that is good, even if I don't decide to do it that way. Like, I might keep it like this only to keep the lines shorter. But I'm happy that this never gets used anywhere except right there. Cool. So, I don't think I'm going to do anything more with this right now. My brain is a little tired because this was kind of a pretty hardcore, deep in the weeds screen share, whatever. See, I can't even speak English. Stream is the word I'm looking for. So I'll probably finish this one now and be back on Tuesday to do some more stuff. And I think on Tuesday I will do what we talked about last Tuesday, which was work on starting to clean these tests up. What I think I want to do is, if you look at the product checkouts controller, right now we complete a purchase and then we fulfill that purchase and then we return a response. And a lot of the complexity in these tests comes from the fact that we are fulfilling purchases in this controller. So I think what I'm leaning towards doing is firing an event in here. Like, whenever a purchase is complete, fire like a purchase successful or purchase complete event, and then have an event listener listen for that and handle the fulfillment of the purchase. And then in this test, we'll be able to remove a lot of the assertions that only matter when something gets fulfilled and replace all of it with just an assertion that the event was fired. So I think that will be like a nice kind of boundary that we can cut into the code and split the tests up a little bit and make things a little bit simpler. So that's going to be it for today. Thank you for checking out the stream and letting me share what I'm working on. And hopefully you picked up a tip or two or found it interesting. And I'll see you on Tuesday if you're going to be around for that. Thanks, everyone. Have a good weekend.